Okay, so we are live at the OPID conference for our session. So I'm going to slowly roll us into this to allow folks to arrive. Let me just check real quick. Yep, we've got some folks starting to show up. Excellent. So I'm Siobhan Stalker. I'm a faculty member at UW Superior, and I serve on our OPID Advisory Council for our campus. And I have the privilege of introducing our presenters today. They're all from UW La Crosse. And so today we will be hearing from three individuals, Tesia Marshik, Alysa Remsburg, and Adam Driscoll, who are here to explain to us the development of a new instrument for student ratings of teaching, which I am very, very interested in learning more about. The presenters have coordinated this so that there'll be breaks in between each of their segments, at which time they'll be able to address any questions that you may have. So you can save your questions for those breaks and ask them then, but you can also use the live Q&A feature. I'll be helping to monitor that, and then when they're done with their presentation, I'm sure each of our presenters will be reviewing that as well. So please use the live Q&A and if you would like, or hold on to your questions until our pause breaks in between the presenters and they can respond to you. And so, oh, I'm realizing, sorry, forgot to ask who's going first. Is that Tesia? Are you up first? Nope. Okay. Adam, sorry about that. All right, so we'll hear first from Adam Driscoll. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Siobhan, for that lovely introduction. And hello to everybody else here. Thank you all for joining us on this Friday afternoon. I'm Adam Driscoll, and along with my colleagues Tesia Marshik and Alysa Remsburg, we're going to be talking about some of the work we've been doing at UWL regarding developing a new instrument for student ratings of teaching. So the three of us are here as representatives of the UWL Ad Hoc SEI Committee. This committee was formed back in 2018 in response to campus concerns regarding the use of SEIs at UWL and their potential for bias, particularly against female faculty and faculty of color. Now, both the purpose and the work of the committee has evolved since our original formation. Initially, we were charged with doing a systematic investigation into the utility of student ratings of teaching, as well as exploring UWL faculty and student attitudes regarding the use of SEIs at UWL. And to this end, the committee did a pretty extensive review of the literature on student ratings of teaching, focusing on measurement validity, the potential for implicit bias, and best practices concerning the use of student ratings of teaching. We also conducted a survey of UWL faculty and department chairs, asking a number of questions about focusing, pretty much looking at how departments and faculty regarded student ratings of teaching, how useful they found them, and potential concerns with their use on UWL. More recently, we were charged with exploring other potential tools to use for student ratings of teaching, as well as developing and testing one for use here at UWL. Now, one thing I want to clarify up front is the language we're using. We like to use the phrase student ratings of teaching, as we feel that more accurately represents what students are qualified to do. Students lack the pedagogical training and the correct perspective to really evaluate instruction. What they can do is rate their perception of the teaching that they encounter. At the same time, the common parlance is SEIs, or student evaluations of instruction, and when this committee was formed, that was the title we were given, as that's the phrase most people recognize and use. It's for the SEI committee who's looking at student ratings of teaching. But with either phrase, we're referring to the standard process I'm sure you're all familiar with, where at the end of the term, students answer a few quick questions along some very specific criteria, rating the instructor in the class, and then usually having some opportunity for some kind of open-ended qualitative feedback. So first off in this presentation, I'm going to provide a quick overview of the literature on student ratings of teaching and then summarize what we found in our survey of UWL's faculty. Following that, Tesia will describe some of the best practices associated with the use of student ratings of teaching and what we broadly should be doing to better solicit and use student feedback in the classroom. And then Alysa will walk us through our ongoing work developing and testing our alternative instrument, the Learning Environment Survey, or LENS. As Siobhan mentioned, we'll kind of be taking a brief pause between each one of those sections to answer any questions anyone has on that specific material. And then at the end, we'll also be opening up the field for any other questions people have, because we are really eager to hear what people think and what everybody else has been doing at their respective institutions. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about what the literature shows regarding SEIs, first addressing their actual utility in measuring teaching effectiveness. And here I'm simply going to be providing a broad overview of the findings and a few highlights. If anyone is interested in more specifics or in which studies we're pulling these findings from, we do have some optional slides at the end where we go through our references. Now, regarding the validity of SEIs, the literature is pretty conclusive that they aren't capturing what we tend to treat them as capturing. They're not an effective measure of either the quality of instruction or student learning. Multiple recent high-quality meta-analyses have shown that SEI scores generally fail to correlate with student learning. Instead, what they capture most directly is student satisfaction with instruction. Now, student satisfaction can be an indirect measure of student learning when all other things are equal. But as we all know, just because students are satisfied, that doesn't mean the course was well taught or that students learned a lot. At the same time, just because students aren't satisfied, that does not automatically mean the course was poorly taught or that the students didn't learn a lot. Interestingly, the literature has shown that the correlation between SEIs and teaching effectiveness has actually decreased steadily over the past decade. So their actual relevance is decreasing. Additionally, a longitudinal study of over 1,000 university students found that teachers whose students perform better in subsequent classes, meaning the students in those classes likely learn more, those teachers received worse evaluations from their students. So in that case, the SEIs were inversely correlated with student learning. So SEI scores are by no means meaningless, but neither can we accurately claim that they directly measure effective teaching. Now, looking at the literature on potential bias in student ratings of teaching, we also see very clear and consistent results that SEIs are rife with bias. In fact, the traditional SEI instrument is better at measuring students' implicit bias than it is at measuring instructors' effectiveness. There's a wide range of studies that have shown SEI scores to be biased toward male faculty over female faculty, and this is perhaps the most consistent and best corroborated finding in the literature on SEIs, and some of my own work has actually helped demonstrate that fact. Secondly, it's pretty well established phenomena that SEI scores are highly sensitive to implicit bias against instructors of color. There's less work that demonstrates this, but it's still a rather consistent finding in the literature. While race and gender are the two forms of implicit bias that have been relatively well documented in SEIs, and corroborated again by a wide range of studies, that doesn't mean other forms of implicit bias aren't also being captured in SEIs. There simply hasn't been enough research that has documented this fact. However, the few studies that we were able to find that examines other dimensions of bias did support SEIs being sensitive to bias against transgender instructors, instructors students believed to be gay, or instructors with a nationality other than that of the students. So that's an overview of what the literature shows. I'm now going to narrow in and discuss what we saw in our survey of UWL La Crosse instructors regarding their attitudes toward the current SEI instrument. And for the most part, the survey demonstrated a high degree of dissatisfaction with the current SEI instrument used at UW La Crosse. We had 307 of our 578 instructors respond to our survey, and the results were overwhelmingly negative regarding the utility of SEI scores. Most faculty felt that they didn't accurately reflect their teaching. Most faculty did not use the SEI scores for professional development for trying to improve their teaching. Most faculty thought that the SEI scores were biased by gender, race, disability, or sexual orientation. However, most faculty also felt that SEI scores were weighed heavily in matters of personnel decisions. 40% of UWL faculty actually have tried to change their appearance, their mannerism, or their accent in an effort to improve their SEI scores. And probably the most problematic is that 30% have knowingly sacrificed student learning to try and achieve higher SEIs. Additionally, UWL students have indicated dissatisfaction with the current SEI instrument as they feel it does not accurately capture their views and that faculty don't actually change their teaching in response to SEI feedback. So basically, nobody on our campus likes the current SEI instrument or feels that it is particularly useful. So one last point I want to touch upon before I turn things over to my colleagues is pretty relevant regarding why all this matters so much. Certainly, if we're using a flawed measure to capture student feedback, that has negative consequences for how we develop and how we evaluate our teaching. Additionally, there are a number of social justice ramifications if we're using an instrument that so clearly discriminates against certain groups of instructors. However, those in decision-making positions don't always listen to those types of concerns. So there's another one we can point out, and that's issues of legal liability. If SEI scores are clearly biased, then their use in personnel decisions could qualify as a discriminatory practice in the UWL system. A number of professional societies have spoken to this point, led by the American Sociological Association's 2009 statement on student evaluations of teaching. And that statement basically made the same point we just did, that these measures are flawed instruments that are highly sensitive to implicit bias. And that statement has been endorsed by at least 20 other academic societies. This point was recently demonstrated in an arbitration decision up in Ryerson University in Ontario, Canada. A formal grievance was filed by the faculty at that institution back in 2009. In 2018, an Ontario arbitrator, William Kaplan, directed Ryerson University to ensure that SEIs, quote, are not used to measure teaching effectiveness for promotion and tenure. The arbitrator stated in his ruling that expert evidence presented by the Faculty Association, quote, establishes with little ambiguity that a key tool in assessing teaching effectiveness is flawed. And in this case, he cited many of the exact same studies that we have, all of which show the biases around gender, ethnicity, accent, age, or even attractiveness, all can factor into student ratings of instruction, making the SEIs deeply discriminatory. So basically, the legal precedent has been set that how we're using SEIs up to this point is discriminatory. And a number of other major institutions have started moving away from SEIs. University of Southern California decided to stop using them in 2018, and additionally, the University of Oregon Faculty Senate has moved away from using SEIs in any kind of personnel matters. So in addition to all those other flaws, using SEIs in promotion and tenure decisions may be leaving the UW system in a precarious spot, legally speaking. So at this point, I'm going to pause and open up the floor to any questions people may have for at least what I've covered so far. And if people don't want to ask a question right now, we will also have a time after all three of us have spoken to also be addressing questions. So I'll stop yammering for a second there. We'll see if anybody has any questions.
We do have one in the Q&A about whether you can remember offhand the actual correlation coefficient between learning and SEI scores.
No. Quick question. I totally do not, but I tell you what, while Tesia is speaking, I can look that up and have that for you later in the section. So again, just looking for what the actual correlation coefficient between learning and SEIs. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah. All of that, and I'll have that then after everybody else is done talking. Any other questions for now? All right, then I'm going to turn things over to Tesia, and she's going to talk with all of you about how we should be using student feedback to improve instruction.
Thank you, Adam. Hi, I'm Tesia Marshik. And so my section is reviewing basically the literature on best practices, many of which were derived out of the documented biases and problems that Adam just described in his section. And if you don't mind advancing the slide, please. Thank you. And so there's a list. There's actually, some of these can be more detailed when you get down to it as far as the actual format and structure of how the SEIs or the instruments that we're using are set up. Again, I'm using the acronym SEIs here, but as Adam said, it's probably not the best term to use given students' lack of ability and experience to truly know what effective teaching really is. but we're using that just for the sake of ease and consistency right now. And so again, these are best practices derived from the literature that have been actually recommended for decades. So many of these best practices and strategies are not particularly new, but for one reason or probably many reasons, some institutions are more or less effective at actually implementing them. And so one of the very first recommendations is that student feedback should really just be viewed as one part of a bigger, more holistic evaluation of teaching if we are going to use it for evaluation purposes. And so in addition to garnering student feedback, which we do believe is important, students should have a voice. Students are the ones in the classroom with the instructor day in and day out. And so their perceptions should matter and should be important and valuable to us. But at the end of the day, again, given some of the biases and some of their limitations in their ability to really objectively evaluate effective teaching, it is recommended that other sources are used. And that can include a lot of different things, including things like peer observation. So actually coming to a class session and evaluating and kind of monitoring what's going on. It could also include things like lesson study or reviews of teaching materials by either peers or trained teaching professionals. It could include participation in instructor development activities. So to what extent is the instructor actually striving to learn more about teaching and to implement new practices in his or her teaching? It can also include in-class assessments, so their own evaluations of students' learning in particular contexts or for particular assignments in their classes, and also things like just general instructor self-reflection. So asking the instructor, again, to describe not just their teaching philosophy, but ways in which their teaching has changed over time in response to their students' learning or lack thereof, and things that they've done to actually improve their overall effectiveness in that regard. So the first part is, again, one part of a bigger picture. The second recommendation is recognizing the content of the instruments themselves. Those questions should actually be contextualized, again, as students' perceptions and students' experiences in the classroom, as opposed to calling them actual teaching evaluations. And again, that goes back to acknowledging that students aren't necessarily qualified to make that determination. They are good at giving us their perceptions. They can tell us their experiences, and that's important. And so questions ought to be framed that way. The instrument itself ought to be labeled that way. And the questions themselves ideally should actually link back to research-based teaching practices, which of course there's a whole literature about effective teaching practices. And you can look at meta-analyses and Hattie's research about which practices are more or less likely to be effective and their overall impact. And so the more the questions can actually tie back to specific practices, not only the more informative is that going to be for the instructor, but it's also going to make it easier to address, because those are intervention points. Those are areas where we know there's lots of potential education, right, and training available. And so instead of, vague or relatively vacuous questions like, overall, how excellent was this instructor, right, which doesn't really tell us anything about the specifics of what they're doing that may or may not be contributing to student learning. Again, the questions should be more targeted towards particular practices. In response to, again, the research on bias, what some of that research suggests is that bias particularly comes out with open-ended comments, especially when they are broad open-ended comments, like, just tell us what you think about this instructor. Students are much more likely not only to be biased in what they write about, but to describe irrelevant or relatively extraneous characteristics like how the professor wore their hair or what kind of clothing they wore, or how attractive they were. And so again, the recommendation is that, similar to what I was mentioning with the previous point, open-ended comments should be targeted towards particular practices or particular principles that we know actually do impact student learning in a meaningful way. Number 4 is this idea that instructors should be evaluated individually as opposed to being compared against each other, because we know, again, bias exists, and that makes those comparisons less fair. But we know there are also differences in how students rate courses, for example, based on whether it's required, whether it's general education or a course in their major. Things like course size also impact students' perceptions of the course. And so in many cases, when we're comparing instructors, it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges. We know there are differences across domains or across subjects as well. And so instead of making direct comparisons to other instructors, best practices would suggest that instead we're going to look at an individual instructor and their own kind of patterns of development over time. And so also embedded in this principle is the idea that we shouldn't be making any dramatic or drastic decisions based on one case or one class or even one semester. Right? Because we know, again, there's lots of different factors that can influence what happens in any given situation or in any given class. So instead, we're looking at the bigger picture and we're following that instructor over time to see, are there clear patterns of what may or may not be happening? And is there any evidence, again, that the instructor is doing something to effectively address factors that actually matter or using strategies that actually impact student learning? Next slide, please. And then again, 3 more best practices. The first one reminds us that we have to be really careful when we're interpreting those results. Again, because of a lot of the issues that Adam and I have already mentioned, because we know they're biased, considering to what extent bias might be influencing the ratings that one instructor gets, again, compared to another. We also know things like response rates matter. Sometimes response rates are abysmally low, and the lower the response rates are, the lower number of students who are actually completing them, the more likely you're going to get skewed results. So in theory, you want to get as many students as possible, ideally 80% or so of any given class, to get a better representation of what's really going on, instead of only getting the students that are the most angry, which is more often the case, or even on the flip side, only hearing from the students who absolutely love them, right? You want to get a more balanced view. The research clearly says we should focus more, again, on modal or patterns of responses as opposed to means or averages, because again, those numbers can be skewed by really high or in particularly really low ratings. And again, when we're looking at the open-ended comments, it's really important to look for themes or patterns in those as well. And this can be useful not just from a how am I interpreting, a colleague's or somebody else's evaluations, but from the instructor standpoint too, because as you may or may not know, there's a lot of research that suggests that negative comments and negative feedback tend to stand out a lot more than the positive stuff. And so our tendency, it might only be 2 out of, let's say, 40 students that say something really negative about us or you. And that doesn't mean it doesn't deserve attention, right? Just because not a lot of students say something doesn't mean that it's something that you can automatically ignore. It's still something to consider. But again, in the grander scheme of things, if we're looking at patterns, we're more likely to get a better idea of how most students are feeling or what most students are reporting as being effective or ineffective in that class. And so the more we can actually provide thematic summaries of those comments to instructors, the more likely that information is going to be useful, and the less likely they're going to perseverate on maybe any one detail, whether those are negative details or maybe only focusing on the positive. That ties into the next point, in that instructors ideally should have the opportunity to actually discuss the feedback they get from students with trained professionals, whether that's people in the teaching, a campus teaching center, or whether that's with peers that have been trained in effective teaching practices or best practices for their discipline, because again, it can vary by discipline. Many times, many campuses, and even on our own campus, there's wide variation in how much support people are actually given regarding SEIs, or how much guidance they're given on what to do with them. Sometimes it's literally just dump the SEIs to the instructor and that's it. And some instructors are going to be more or less well equipped to actually know how to interpret that feedback or how to read that and what to do with it. So the more we can make that a formalized process of meeting with someone who can help them interpret the data, the more likely it's going to be meaningful. And that again ties in to the next point, in that ideally all stakeholders should be educated and trained about what SEIs are. So in other words, what is the purpose? Why are we collecting this data, and how is it going to be used? We found in our survey with faculty and instructors on our campus that again, there's wide variation in what they think is happening and how much they think SEIs are being weighed in things like personnel decisions, whether or not they feel like SEIs might be used to get them, right, or to penalize them, as opposed to being used for more formative purposes. Lots of variations. So the more we can be transparent and upfront about, look, this is what they're supposed to be used for, this is how we will be using them, the more likely not only you're going to quell that anxiety, but again, it's going to lead to a more valid process overall. And that includes, again, things like proper interpretation. So understanding issues like bias, understanding why means might be skewed compared to modal responses, et cetera. And so that includes, when I say all stakeholders, I'm talking about not just the instructors, but I'm talking about department chairs, again, teaching professionals that might be working with instructors on how to interpret it. And also a part that often gets missed is educating the students and making sure that students know why we're collecting their feedback and in theory, what kind of feedback is actually beneficial to us. So to what extent are we framing this process for students so that they are actually more likely to give feedback, not only that is meaningful, but that's appropriate. Next slide, please. And so I thought I would briefly summarize what the Regent policy is, since all of us share these general, these guidelines, right, regardless of what campus we're on. And you can see I've just picked and chosen just a few points to highlight. There's actually a very explicit policy, and the link is on this slide, excuse me, where they outline that, yes, student evaluations, they have to be collected. So we have to collect some form of feedback regardless of what campus we're on. And that they can be used for both improving teacher effectiveness, so enhancing our education, but also evaluating performance. Again, that second point should be maybe questionable given some of the more recent legal cases that Adam described. But at this point in time, the Regents recognize that it should be used for both. But institutions actually have a lot of flexibility in deciding exactly what methods they use. And what type of feedback they gather from students. The Board of Regents recognizes the possibility of unintentional bias. And from my understanding, I think there was an edit to that policy not too long ago where they put that in there explicitly. So they recognize that there are potential bias issues, and they do encourage institutions, therefore, to try to minimize that bias as much as possible, not only in the type of data that they're collecting, but how it's being interpreted. And consistent with that very first best practice that I mentioned, the Board of Regents does also recognize that SEI should only be used as one data point when we're evaluating teaching effectiveness. So again, not as a substitute for other methods, but in conjunction with lots of other information that's going to give us a clearer picture of how effective an instructor might actually be. Briefly, I'll mention our current SEI instrument at UWL. And current, I could say traditional, I could say old. This is the one that is, adopted by our faculty senate that we've been using for a while. It may or may not look familiar. In hindsight, we did research at what other institutions were doing in different forms of SEIs across the country at different institutions, but we didn't actually collect data from other UW campuses. And so we are interested, just a side note, in hearing what your SEI process actually looks like and what your instruments look like. We kind of assumed that they were similar, but we realized that that might not be a safe assumption. So you can see ours across the university, there's 6 standard rating items, and you can see what those are, all rated on a Likert type scale. And then open-ended comments are actually optional, and they vary across departments. So departments write their own open-ended questions if they want to collect that data, and some departments collect no open-ended data at all. And many times that's motivated by the concern about the large amount of bias that comes out with open-ended comments. And so we have some standardization, but there's still some variation. And like I alluded to before, there's actually still a lot of variation in how this data is reported to individual instructors and how it's interpreted. So we do create what's called an interpolated median score from items 2 through 6. So it's kind of like it's a continuous median that kind of combines the data from those 5 items, and that gets reported to department chairs and for personnel decisions at higher levels as well. But aside from that, there's not really any other standardized process. I will briefly mention that we used to include rank as well. So within your department, every instructor was ranked according to that interpolated or fractional median score. But we were able as a committee to successfully lobby our faculty senate to remove that ranking comparison because, again, of the limitations and the problematic assumptions that go in with what that rank actually means. So we don't have that anymore. Okay. And so in sum, we think we can do better than this. If you want to advance to the next slide, please. And so this is where the lens comes into play. So as I mentioned, we did research on other campuses across the country to try to figure out, well, what are better systems and what are better ways to actually collect data from students that's going to be more meaningful and ideally less biased. And one of the instruments that we found that we were particularly impressed by, because it seemed to represent a lot of these best practices that I described, is a survey instrument developed by Dr. Zinta Byrne at Colorado State University. And so what we did was modify that to be a little bit more specific to some of our needs and goals at our institution, and to ideally make it even more consistent with best practices. But as you can see here, the benefits of the lens is that it is first and foremost framed from the perspective of measuring students' experiences of the learning environment, as opposed to saying that it's evaluations of teaching. Another strong benefit is that every question is actually connected to a principle of good practice in undergraduate education. So again, we're not asking just arbitrary or vague or really broad questions. We're trying to ask questions that directly target educational principles. And that's based on a classic article from the 1980s by Chickering and Gamson. The other nice thing is that because it's connected to principles, it provides evidence-based data that we can actually use for instructor development. And so what Dr. Byrne did, and what we're planning to do, is connect all of the questions and all of the content on the survey to actual faculty development opportunities. Again, so we can directly address if there are concerns with certain areas. Student responses are reported as frequencies, as opposed to, again, means, and the open-ended comments that we include are very targeted. So it asks for specific open-ended feedback about those items. And again, there's no faculty comparisons. Next slide. And so here are those principles. I mentioned the 7 principles for good practice in undergraduate education. The first one is encouraging contact between students and communication between students and faculty. Developing reciprocity and cooperation, or kind of group work among students. And group work can take many forms, from discussions to actually group-based projects. Encouraging active learning, giving prompt and useful feedback, emphasizing time on task, communicating high expectations, and ultimately promoting inclusivity and respecting diversity in the classroom. And so, as I said, every item on our survey actually ties back to one of these principles. And we have examples if you want to see them later. I'm actually a little bit over time right now, but I'm happy to answer questions if there are any about this section.
I suggest that people put those in the chat, and then you can be answering them while Alyssa presents, if that's okay. So
that
again,
would
you
be
can put those
great.
Questions, in the live Q&A, and we'll go ahead and turn things over to Alyssa Remsburg. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alyssa, and happy to be with you this afternoon. So we have piloted this initial use of the LENS survey, Learning Environment Survey, at UWL for this semester. And so in this pilot study, we're looking at 3 main goals: to investigate how well it helps instructors with teaching development. Do faculty perceive the LENS feedback to be useful? We're also planning to work with our Center for Advancing Teaching and Learning to align the LENS questions with teaching development resources. And we've seen that at Colorado State, they really nicely align this. So if you're not happy with a certain type of feedback in one section of the LENS, then where do you seek help on campus for improving that aspect of your teaching? We also want to know if the LENS gives students a good voice in this process. Does the survey facilitate feedback on items that are high priority for the students? So for example, at the end of the LENS survey this semester, we'll be asking, did the survey structure and content allow me to express concerns I had about the learning environment? And then lastly, to the extent possible, we'd like to explore group differences in ratings or feedback collected to see if we can find any evidence of possible biases in how students are answering for certain groups of faculty. And so we wouldn't want to work with any samples, smaller than 5 or so for minority groups on campus. So we want to see what's possible with our data from the pilot study. We can go to the next slide. So just to show you where we are on this pilot study, we did actually in December, so last semester, have some of the members of this committee use a version of the Lens survey in our courses. So we call this the pre-pilot test run. And so we have a little bit of data I'll share with you about that. Then we started recruiting faculty earlier this semester after we got Institutional Review Board approval for our faculty to be participants. And then at the end of this semester, so in May, we'll be distributing the survey using Qualtrics. Then we'll be analyzing the data with our collaborator at CSU and making a recommendation to faculty for the fall. And so we will see if we're happy with the results so far before we make a change to our instrument for assessing student feedback. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide, and I'll show you what we found from that pre-pilot study, which we did last December. So this had just 11 classes where they used this survey, and students were asked. I was able to provide feedback about all the specific aspects of the class that I wanted to address. So after they completed the Lens survey, then they had these survey questions. 83% said, yes, the Lens did address all the parts of the class I wanted to. 15% were neutral. We can go on to the next one, very similar. So here we asked, how well did the survey allow you to address your concerns? 79% said that this was very well, 21% neutral. And then there's just one more on that early data from December. The length of the survey, 70% said it was the optimal length, 30% too long. So that's also something we're looking for more feedback. Again, this was just a few classes that we tried it out with in the fall semester. Okay, and so overall, with the actual pilot study we're doing this semester, we have 111 faculty participants, so that's about 20% of the UWL instructors. And we asked our faculty to enroll and they had to describe, some of their demographics. And we found so far that, let's see, there was 30% of the courses who plan to use this Lens survey were in general education. So the rest would be in, specific programs. 20% of the faculty who enrolled in using the Lens survey were non-white, as they self-reported. And so we have also a wide variety of departments, all colleges, all different ranks, a wide range of ages. So we're hoping that this pilot survey will represent well the faculty that we do have at our university. And so after the students take the survey in May, then we will be sending the Lens feedback back to the instructor, and then we'll ask the instructor to fill out a survey about how useful was the Lens feedback, and overall, what are their perceptions of how well it worked for them. All right, and so that just brings us back to, with this pilot study right now, again, we're looking at overall, is our new tool, the Lens survey, going to be helpful for teaching development, inclusion of what matters to students, student voice, and does it help address the concerns of possible biases with this student rating of teaching? So we're looking for something more inclusive. And with that, I think I'll go to the next slide. And basically, we're ready to hear what questions you all have, and would love to hear about any similar work or other ideas on your campuses. So thanks for your interest in this presentation about student ratings.
If I can jump in to address the earlier question of the correlation coefficient between learning and SEIs, I'm going to jump down here to where the actual citation of the study we pulled this from. It was this last one here, number 5, Udall et al., 2017. And they said that SEIs account for only 1% of the difference, the variation in student learning is what they found in that meta-analysis.
And then there was also a question in the chat and I will admit I'm having a hard time seeing all the text, but wondering about how department chairs and administration responded to the findings. So has it been a pretty supportive experience? Have there been folks who maybe, I can imagine, kind of be thrown by some of this information to find that something that most universities are really relying on may have some real concerns to that?
I think if I'll take first stab at that. Overall, I'd say our faculty senate have been very favorable of this. A lot of people saying this is great work. A lot of people being really excited to participate in the pilot study. A lot of people really excited to see what the new lens survey looks like. At the same time, that has not been universal, and we've definitely seen some people have expressed some hesitancy, particularly about the idea that this new instrument would be more work. Tesia and Alysa, you want to add that?
I would just add, to add on to what you said about more work, there is some concern about how can we condense this to make it a smaller amount of information when it comes to how it's being used and considered in things like personnel decisions. Because before, again, we had that nice, not really nice because it had all sorts of problems, but one score, the fractional median, that was really quick to see. And now, by definition, we're saying, no, it's not that simple. And so we still have to figure out kind of which aspects of this survey might be most useful to, administrators and such, as far as trying to I don't know, capture kind of the overall picture of instructor effectiveness.
And can I ask a question about that? So I understand that for personnel decisions, that single value is used, but were instructors provided more nuanced information about their own course evaluations? Would they get the full comments and scores for each of those questions? Yeah.
Actually, if we want to answer Sarah's question, we can real quick show some of the questions from the lens. Because I know we didn't have time for, but here's just an example of some of the questions that appear in that and what they look like, which, as you can see, are pretty different than what the original SEI instrument was.
And these slides also illustrate the principle that it directly ties back to as well.
And I believe Sarah had asked about using the survey mid-semester, and that is something that was recommended at CSU, and we also recommend that. We're just starting with the end of semester pilot for right now. I personally did use a version of this in my classes last semester and this semester, and have found it helpful for helping me adjust how well we're doing so far.
It's kind of a workload issue that we're trying not to overwhelm people too much, especially initially when we're trying to get feedback. But we also agree that that's a valuable part of the process.
And I think someone had asked about optimal length of the survey. And so that's some of what we're trying to assess with our pilot. And I think that is a challenge, especially with the mid-semester, for taking a lot of time from the students to answer a whole bunch of questions, and then you do the same ones again at the end. So we're trying to think about how to streamline it a little bit.
Yeah, but in general, the goal is that it should be 5 to 10 minutes of student time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense as to whether you're hitting that benchmark just yet, or is it still going beyond, on average, that 10-minute mark?
I think our average is around 10 minutes now.
That's what mine was for my mid-semester evaluations, but definitely that's something we want to see from this trial run of actually the large scale. We'll actually have better data then. I know we were warned that we have a hard cutoff, so.
Oh, I was just going to say it might get easier over time too, as people become, especially students become more familiar with the measure itself.
So I'm going to say we probably are out of time for questions. We were told it will end automatically as this continues to count down, and that stresses me out a little. So thank you all so much. This was phenomenal. I think you can tell that folks are very interested in learning more, so people will probably be reaching out maybe with additional questions or requests for resources. So thank you all, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference.
Thank you all for listening.
Thanks a lot.